Thanks very much. It's great to hear from Simone and Ellen, who are on the other side of the PhD process. I am very early in that stage, so I'm a second-year PhD student. I'm doing it part-time, so my timeline is a little bit longer, unfortunately. But what I wanted to talk about today were results from a scoping review that I did last year that was looking at the different ways that people measure emissions from research activities and why we should be doing that in the first place. So why do we need to measure research emissions? So we know that clinical research is really important. It gives us an evidence base for informing the safety and efficacy of different treatments and interventions and therapies, with the ultimate goal of improving patient outcomes. But I suppose something we don't always think about is the environmental cost or the environmental impact of that research. So previous literature has shown that around 4% of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from our healthcare systems. And a previous review that was looking specifically at clinical trials estimated that 350,000 clinical trials generated approximately 27 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So there's really significant emissions generated from clinical research activities, and it's something that we should be addressing. But at the minute, there isn't really standardized methods for how we measure those emissions or report those emissions. So that's what I wanted to look at during this scoping review. So that was the aim. So look at the literature and see how people are measuring emissions, specifically focusing on four main objectives. So what research activities are people assessing? What are the tools and methods they're using to quantify those emissions? What are the kind of common domains and subdomains of measurement? And what are the units used to report those emissions? So the scoping review followed your kind of standard scoping review guidance documents, ARC-SCI and O'Malley, and JBI scoping review guidance as well. So we searched 7 databases. They were a mix of health and non-health related databases, and included grey literature. We had kind of basic terms around clinical research, carbon emissions, and healthcare, and did different iterations and versions of those. In terms of the results then, so you can see that we screened 2,300 studies and we ended up with 15. Of these, nearly 87% were clinical trials, and nearly all of them are retrospective analyses. They applied those tools and methods and they worked backwards to calculate the emissions from those studies. In terms of the reporting units then, you can see on the left a word cloud. So this was really, there was a lot of high heterogeneity in terms of what the units people used to report those emissions. So you can see that on the left, but the main dominant unit was kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's really important to have a kind of standard reporting unit so that we can kind of cross-compare those studies. Then I wanted to look at specifically the different resources that were in those studies. So we identified 30 different resources and we broke that down into 8 different resource categories. So databases, online calculators, online resources, international standards that looked at measure and life cycle assessments, government resources, other types of reports and guideline documents, consultancy resources, and those specific life cycle assessment methods as well. So for the purpose of the talk today, I just want to touch on 2 of those different resources. So one was databases. We identified 4 different databases that people use to measure emissions that you can see on the left. So XEOBase, CIMAPRO, EcoInvent, and ABPI. What we wanted to look at was how do we summarize what those domains were in each of those databases, who might be the intended users of those databases, the maturity level, so were they novel or were they established, and the access level as well. So were they free for people to use or did they have to pay for them, or were there subscriptions or licenses? So if we take ABPI, for example, so that's a pharmaceutical-focused database. So you could input drug information if you had it, and any kind of packaging and distribution information for a specific drug, and we're going to give you a specific emission associated with that drug. So obviously for the intended users, pharmaceutical emission users will be interested in that. It was an established database, so it had multiple versions, and it was free for access as well. Another common resource that was used then were calculators. So there was a lot of variety in terms of the calculators. Some were really specific and they looked at things like paper. So you could input the paper grade that you were using, the quantity, and whether or not it had recycled content. And again, it would give you an emission associated with that. For clinical trials, obviously, it would be really important to measure things like international travel because that's a really big emitter. So there was 2 different calculators that you could use to calculate flight distance, and that would give you emissions associated with those. And most of those online calculators were free. So what do these findings mean? So for researchers, if you're looking to do like a rigorous assessment of your environmental impact of your research activities, you can opt to use licensed databases, those international standards, or those specific life cycle impact assessment methods. Whereas if you might want to do more rapid or practical estimates, which I think a lot of us would want to do because we mightn't have the resources like the budget or the time to do those really extensive assessments, we can aim for those online calculators, and if you combine them with government emission factor databases, you can get a more robust estimate of your research emissions. And then for funders and policymakers, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of fragmentation and a lot of kind of variety, so we need more standardized approaches for this, specifically so that we can develop any kind of consensus around how we might report those emissions and report those specific activities as well. And what we might see as well is more embedding of environmental impact assessments in our funding frameworks, so in our funding applications, ethics applications, and in our trial designs as well, so that we can move towards carrying out more lower carbon research. And then finally, what do these findings mean specifically for trial methodologies? So if you're applying these different tools and methods, it might give you the opportunity to identify what activities specifically in your trials might be high emissions, and then that might offer you targets that you can use to adapt your trial designs to try and lower those emissions. So a couple of common ones would be around travel. So specifically with international clinical trials, there's huge amounts of emissions generated from flights, from shipping drug products, from people attending meetings across the world. So that's some way that we could reduce emissions if we wanted to opt, like we saw during the pandemic, for more remote visits versus in person. If we reduce the number of emissions or reduce the number of meetings that we do, and the mode of transport we use for transport. And as well as that, kind of things like consumables and data. So what are our data collection methods? Are we storing our data in a more efficient way? Are we trying to not duplicate that data? So if we have large data sets from clinical trials, that we're not having 2 or 3 different blocks of that data in different systems in different drives. So then just to conclude, so there's a lot of literature out there now around research-related emissions, so there's a lot more awareness for the environmental impact in our healthcare systems, but that measurement landscape is really fragmented, so there's a huge variety in the amount of tools and methods that we use, and there's a lack of standardization which we need to address. But with that, we have methodological diversity, so as mentioned, there was a huge amount of different tools, so depending on what your research interests are, depending on what your resources are, you have a lot of different tools to choose from if you want to calculate the emissions from your research. And in general, as kind of researchers and working in institutions, we need to be a little bit more proactive when it comes to measuring and reducing the environmental impact from our research. And then finally, measuring research emissions can inform areas of trial design that we can target to reduce overall emissions. So just a quick thank you to my research team and the UCD Clinical Research Centre for funding this research. Thank you.